In the small Norwegian fishing village of Vesthavn, population 847, on the edge of the Storfjorden in Romsdal County, there was, for 22 years, only one doctor. His name was Dr. Erik Solberg. He had come to Vesthavn in 1983, fresh from a brief post at a Bergen hospital, and had never left. For 22 years he had been the only general practitioner. Within 34 kilometers, he had delivered babies. He had sat with the dying. He had driven in blizzards to reach patients who could not reach him. He knew every family in Vesthavn across 3 generations. He was, without question or qualification, the most trusted man in the village. Between March 2004 and January 2013, 7 of his patients died under his care. The deaths were spread across 9 years. Each one was elderly, or in poor health, or both. Each death certificate was signed by Solberg himself, as was standard practice for a sole GP in a rural community. Each cause of death was documented as natural. Each funeral was attended by the doctor, who stood at the graveside and said the right words. And in each case, the family thanked him for everything he had done. In June 2013, 5 months after the 7th death, a nurse named Karin Lunde sat down at the kitchen table in her house on Fjordvegen 14 in Vesthavn and wrote a letter. She addressed it to the Norwegian Board of Health Supervision in Oslo. She wrote 11 pages by hand. She asked them to look at the deaths. All 7 of them. What the Board of Health Supervision found when they began to look would take 4 years to fully emerge. It would result in the largest criminal investigation in the history of Romsdal County. It would expose not just a killer, but the precise conditions that allowed a killer to operate in plain sight for 9 years. The isolation of a rural community, the unquestionable authority of the sole medical professional, and the very human tendency to trust above all else. This is the full case of Dr. Erik Solberg, the good doctor of Vesthavn, and the 7 patients who trusted him with their lives. Vesthavn is not a place that appears on most maps of Norway. It sits on the southern edge of the Storfjorden, one of the great fjords of the Romsdal region, long and deep and flanked on both sides by mountains that in winter carry snow from October to April, and in summer reflect in the water with such clarity that visitors sometimes describe the fjord as looking like a mirror. The road to Vesthavn runs 34 kilometers from Stranda along the fjord edge, a single carriageway pressed between the water on the left and the mountain wall on the right, occasionally tunneling through the rock entirely for stretches of several hundred meters. In winter, this road is closed by snow and ice for periods of days at a time. In those periods, Vesthavn is accessible only by the ferry service, once daily in winter, which runs only when the fjord is not iced at the village end. There are winters when Vesthavn is effectively cut off from the outside world, for stretches of a week or more. The village itself is arranged on a hillside. The harbor and the harbor front are at the bottom. The stone quay, the small commercial fish processing facility with its smell of brine and diesel. The boat repair yard. Above the harbor front, on the first tier of the hill, the main street, a general store, a post office, the community center, a single-story timber building, where the chess club meets on Thursdays, and the Christmas concert happens in December. The surgery. The surgery occupies the ground floor of a converted 2-story timber building, directly on the harbor front, white-painted, green window frames. Its waiting room window faces the fjord. Above the main street, continuing up the hill, the residential streets. White and ochre timber houses, most of them well-maintained, wood freshly painted, window boxes, even in October, the Norwegian domestic habit of making the exterior of a house speak well of the family within. At the top of the hill, the white wooden church, 19th century, its spire visible from the far side of the fjord, and just below the church, on a flat piece of ground with the best view of the fjord in the entire village, A large white timber house, 2 stories, a carefully maintained garden, a woodpile at the side, kept at all times fully stocked. A dark green Volvo V70 in the drive. Erik Solberg had lived in that house for 22 years when this story begins. He had arrived in Vesthavn as a 30-year-old doctor from Bergen who had, by his own account, fallen in love with the fjord and never felt the need to leave. He had spent 3 decades making himself indispensable to every family in the village. He was the first person they called when something was wrong. He was the last face many of them saw. He had, over those 3 decades, earned a quality of trust that is almost impossible to manufacture, and almost impossible to lose. Before we go any further into what Erik Solberg did, we need to stop and understand who his victims were, because they were not abstractions. They were not case numbers. They were people who had lived in Vesthavn for most or all of their lives, who had known Solberg personally for decades, who had trusted him completely, and who died believing they were in safe hands. The first was Olav Hagen, 78 years old. A retired fisherman who had worked the Storfjorden for 50 years. A widower, his wife Astrid had died in 2001. He lived alone in a yellow timber house on Storfjorden, 2 streets above the harbor. He had 4 children, none of them still in Vesthavn. They had moved to Sandwilsund, to Trondheim, to Oslo, as the young of small Norwegian villages do. He was independent, physically strong for his age, and had, according to Karin Lunde's later account, no history of serious cardiac illness. Olav Hagen died on the 14th of March 2004. Dr. Solberg was called to the house at 7:15 in the morning by a neighbor who had noticed the lights had been on all night. Solberg arrived at 7:32. He was alone in the house for approximately 18 minutes before calling the ambulance. The death certificate recorded cardiac arrest. The family was called. The family thanked the doctor for his promptness and his care. Olav Hagen was buried in the Vesthavn churchyard on the 20th of March. The doctor attended the funeral. The second was Erik Solberg, 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had taught at the Vesthavn primary school for 31 years, which meant she had taught the children, and in some cases the grandchildren, of almost every family in the village. She lived alone in a red timber house on Storfjorden. She was a reader. Her house was known for its books, its warm light, its smell of coffee and paper. She died on the 2nd of November 2005. Official cause, respiratory failure. She had been treated by Solberg for a chest infection in the weeks before her death. The third was Gunnar Elstad, 83 years old, the former harbor master of Vesthavn, a position he had held for 30 years before his retirement. He lived in a large ochre house above the harbor, a house from which he could see every boat that had ever left and returned to the Vesthavn quay. He was the oldest of the 7 victims. He died on the 19th of June 2006, recorded as natural causes, multiple organ failure. His family, like Olav Hagen's, had largely left Vesthavn. His wife was in a care home in Fothasund. He was, in his final year, largely alone. The fourth was Ragna Vik, 69 years old, the widow of the former Vesthavn Council chairman, Halvard Vik, who had died in 2001. She was active in the community, the church council, the women's association, the village historical society. She was also, according to those who knew her well, privately wealthy. Halvard Vik had been a careful investor, and Ragna had inherited a considerable estate. She was healthy for her age. She had no history of heart disease. She died on the 3rd of February 2008, recorded as heart failure. The sixth was Ingeborg Thorsen, 66 years old. This death is the one that broke the pattern open, not because of how she died, but because of who she was. Ingeborg Thorsen was a farmer. She had trained and worked in Filesund before returning to Vesthavn in her 50s to care for her elderly mother. She knew exactly what healthy looked like. And she knew exactly what a body in medically induced distress looked like. She was active, strong, had no significant health history, and had told her daughter Han just 2 weeks before her death that she felt completely well. She died on the 22nd of April 2011, recorded as a sudden cardiac event. She was 66 years old. Karin Lunde prepared her body for the undertaker. Karin Lunde noticed something that morning she was not able to name. She would spend 2 years trying to name. The seventh was Halvard Næss, 79 years old. A retired teacher, like Erik Solberg, he had spent most of his career at the Vesthavn primary school. He and Erik Solberg had been colleagues and friends for 30 years. He had attended her funeral in 2005. He died on the 7th of January 2013, recorded as natural causes. He was the last. After Halvard Næss, Erik Solberg stopped. The question investigators faced in 2015, when the Board of Health Supervision finally triggered a formal police inquiry, was the question that sits at the heart of every medical murder case. How do you prove that a doctor killed a patient, when the doctor is the one who certified the death, when the deaths were spread across 9 years, when every victim was elderly or in poor health, and when the man you are investigating is, by the account of every person in the community, the most trusted person in the village? Detective Inspector Astrid Moen had been transferred to the Romsdal Police District from Oslo 6 months before this case was assigned to her. She had not expected to be in the region long. She had come from high-volume urban investigative work, property crime, organized crime, the dense and relentless caseload of a large city police district. Nothing in her career had prepared her for a case in which the crime scene was an entire village, and every potential witness was also a potential victim. The method Solberg had used was, in its elegance, its simplicity, and its invisibility, one of the most difficult things a forensic investigation can be asked to identify. He had been administering controlled doses of potassium chloride to selected patients during routine home visits, or during visits where the patient was already in a weakened state. Potassium chloride, in sufficient doses, causes cardiac arrest. It leaves no trace that a standard post-mortem examination in a Royal Norwegian context in the 2000s would be expected to find, and it mimics, with almost exact precision, the natural death of an elderly patient with cardiac vulnerabilities. The key piece of evidence that unlocked the method was not found in the surgery. It was found in Solberg's house, in the large white timber house on the hill, in a study on the upper floor. Investigators found a locked desk drawer. Inside the drawer, inside a brown envelope that had been sealed with wax, was a notebook. Not a medical journal, not case notes. A personal notebook, small, leather-covered, the kind bought from a stationery shop, with no name on the cover. Inside it, entries, dates, names, and beside each name, a number. And beside each number, a small symbol, the same symbol, 7 times, next to 7 names. The number beside each name, investigators would establish with the assistance of 2 forensic pharmacologists from the University of Oslo, represented a dosage. Specifically, a potassium chloride dosage calculated to produce cardiac arrest in a patient of a given weight and existing health condition. A dosage that would, in each case, be enough. Not more than enough. Exactly enough. The calculations were precise. They had been made in advance. Every death had been planned. The question that took investigators longest to answer was not how. It was why. Erik Solberg was 61 years old. He had a comfortable life, a respected position, a house with a view of the most beautiful fjord in Norway. He had no financial motive. None of the 7 victims had named him in their wills. and he had made no attempt to benefit financially from any of the deaths. He had no personal grievance against any of the 7 that investigators could establish. He had no history of violence, no psychiatric record, no known ideology that would explain the selection of victims or the decision to kill. The answer, when it finally emerged during the criminal trial, was one that investigators had considered and dismissed twice during the investigation, because it seemed, in its simplicity, insufficient for what had been done. Erik Solberg killed his 7 patients because he believed, sincerely, completely, with the particular certainty of a highly intelligent man who has been the sole authority in a small community for too long, that they were ready to die, that their lives had reached their natural completion, that he, better than anyone else, better than the patients themselves, better than their families, was qualified to make that determination, and that his role as their doctor, the doctor who had cared for them, who had seen them through their lives, who knew them better than any other medical professional ever would, gave him not just the right, but the responsibility to act on that determination. Karin Lunde had worked alongside Erik Solberg for 19 years. She had answered his appointments, prepared his consulting rooms, assisted with procedures, handled his prescriptions, and known, in the way that you know a person you have worked beside for 2 decades, every professional habit, every medical preference. The morning she prepared Ingeborg Thorsen's body for the undertaker, the 22nd of April 2011, Karin Lunde noticed something she could not immediately identify. It was not a mark, it was not a wound, it was something in the presentation of the body, in its specific quality of stillness. That was different from the natural death she had seen. Ingeborg Thorsen had been a nurse. She had been healthy. She had been 66 years old. And the way her body lay, the specific muscular quality of the stillness was, Karin would later tell investigators, the same quality she had seen in the bodies of cardiac patients who had coded in hospital settings, not the gradual release of natural death. The abrupt cessation of chemically induced cardiac arrest. She said nothing for 2 years. She wants this on record. She said nothing for 2 years. And she has never forgiven herself for that. She was not a coward. She told investigators. She was a woman in a village of 847 people, in a community where she had been born, where her husband fished, where her children had been to school, and where the man she was considering accusing had been the most trusted person in that community for 22 years. She needed to be certain, and she needed to find the courage that certainty requires when everything around you tells you to stay silent. She began keeping notes in late 2011. Not accusations, observations. She noted every death she could recall, where Solberg had been the sole attending physician at the time of death. She noted the ages and health profiles of those patients as she remembered them. She went back through the appointment book. She kept copies, as she had always kept copies, a professional habit of 20 years, and cross-referenced the dates of deaths with the dates of Solberg's home visits. In 6 of the 7 cases, Solberg had made a home visit to the patient within 48 hours of their death. In 4 of those cases, the home visit was unscheduled. In June 2013, 5 months after Halvard Næss died, Karin Lunde wrote the 11-page letter to the Norwegian Board of Health Supervision. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied with it. She did not tell her husband. She posted it from the post office in Stranda, not from the Vesthavn post office. From Stranda on a Tuesday morning when she had told Solberg she had a dental appointment. She drove the 34 kilometers along the fjord road, posted the letter, and drove back. She went directly to the surgery. She opened the appointments book. She answered the phone. She sat at her desk with the fjord in the waiting room window and did her job, as she had always done her job, as if nothing had changed. The Board of Health Supervision's preliminary review took 14 months. It was cautious, as such reviews tend to be, cautious, in the specific way of an institution being asked to consider whether a respected medical professional with a 22-year clean record had committed serial homicide. They ordered the exhumation of 3 of the 7 bodies. They commissioned independent medical analysis of the death certificates. And in August 2014, they produced a report that used, with considerable institutional understatement, the phrase, "findings inconsistent with certified cause of death in a minimum of 2 cases. Further investigation strongly recommended." The toxicological analysis of the exhumed remains was conducted by the Norwegian Institute of Public Health in Oslo. The results came back in February 2015. In 2 of the 3 exhumed bodies, Olav Hagen and Ragna Vik, elevated potassium levels were found in tissue samples at concentrations inconsistent with natural post-mortem biochemical changes. In the 3rd, Gunnar Elstad, the oldest victim at 83, the decomposition was too advanced for definitive results, but 2 was enough. 2 was more than enough. Detective Inspector Astrid Moen received the case file on the 17th of March 2015. She read it in one sitting: the Board of Health Supervision report, the toxicology results, Karin Lunde's original letter, and the preliminary background on Solberg. She drove to Vesthavn the following morning. She parked at the quay. She looked at the surgery building with its green window frames and its waiting room window facing the fjord. She looked up the hill at the large white house. She looked at the church at the top of the hill and the churchyard beside it. She took out her notebook and wrote 3 words: isolation, authority, trust. She underlined all 3. Then, she began. Moen's first action in Vesthavn was not to interview Solberg. It was to spend 3 days speaking to the families of the 7 victims. She drove to Bylesund to speak to Olav Hagen's children. She spoke to Erik Solberg's sister, who still lived in Vesthavn on Kisvegen, 2 doors from the red house where Merit had kept her books and her coffee and her lamp. She spoke to the former harbor master's family, to Ragna Vik's daughter, to Petterdal's son, to Halvard Næss's widow, and she spoke, at the very end of those 3 days, to Ingeborg Thorsen's daughter. Han Thorsen was 38 years old. She lived in Trondheim. She drove to Vesthavn to meet Moen at the community center, the single-story timber building on the main street where the chess club meets on Thursdays. They sat at a table by the window. Han Thorsen told Moen that her mother had been completely healthy, that she had spoken to her 2 weeks before her death, and her mother had said she felt perfectly well, that the death had been a complete shock. And then she said something that stopped Moen writing. Hanne Thorsen said that 3 days before her mother's death, Dr. Solberg had made an unscheduled home visit, that her mother had mentioned it on the phone. She had called Han that evening. She said Solberg had come by to check on her after the chest cold she had had the previous month. She said he had been very kind. He had stayed for coffee. They had talked about the village, about the spring, about Hanne's children. He had taken her blood pressure and said everything looked good. He had left at around 4 in the afternoon. Ingeborg Thorsen had died in her sleep. 3 days later. This pattern, the unscheduled visit, the social call, the coffee, the kindness, the medical bag open at some point during the visit, appeared in 5 of the 7 cases when Moen went back through the family accounts with this specific detail in mind. It had not been noticed before, because there had been no reason to look for it. It was simply what Dr. Solberg did. He visited patients. He was thorough. He was kind. He stayed for coffee. That was who he was. That was who he had always been. Erik Solberg was arrested on the 14th of October 2015. He was 61 years old. It was a Tuesday. Not a chess evening. A regular working day. He had seen 4 patients that morning. He was at his desk in the left consulting room when Moen and two officers from the Romsdal Police District came through the surgery door at 11:45 a.m. Karin Lunde would say later that the moment before Moen knocked on the consulting room door was the longest moment of her professional life. She had known it was coming. Moen had called her the previous evening to tell her the arrest was scheduled for the following morning, and to ask her to ensure that Solberg would be in the surgery. Karin had come to work that morning and sat at her reception desk and answered the phone and made appointments and sent out reminders and done every element of her job exactly as she always had, knowing that the man in the room to her left was about to be arrested for the murder of 7 people she had known. Moen knocked once. Solberg said, "Come in." She opened the door. He was at his desk, writing up notes, his white coat on, his wire-rimmed glasses on, his navy sweater visible at the collar. He looked up. He saw Moen. He saw the 2 officers behind her in the corridor. And then he did something that Moen would describe in her testimony at the trial as the most unsettling moment of the entire investigation. He took off his glasses. He folded them. He placed them precisely in the center of his desk. He looked at Moen, and he said, "I have been expecting someone like you for some time." He was handcuffed in the surgery corridor, in front of the waiting room, in front of Karin Lunde, in front of 2 patients who would tell everyone they knew about it before the day was over. He did not resist. He walked out through the surgery door with his hands behind his back. And as he came through the door onto the harbor front, he paused for one moment, the officers allowing it, perhaps out of instinct or confusion, and he looked up the hill at his house, the large white timber house with its view of the fjord, the garden, the woodpile, the dark green Volvo in the drive. He looked at it for approximately 5 seconds. Then he looked at the fjord. Then he looked straight ahead, and he walked to the police vehicle. The trial of Erik Solberg opened at the meent.The Romsdal District Court in Vesthavn on the 6th of March 2017. It ran for 6 weeks. It was the most attended criminal trial in the history of that court. Every session was full, and on the first day a queue formed outside the building before the doors opened. In the rain, in March, the kind of attendance that speaks to how completely a case has taken hold of a community's sense of itself. Erik Solberg pleaded not guilty to all 7 counts of murder. His defense argued that the toxicological evidence was insufficient, that post-mortem potassium elevation is notoriously unreliable as an indicator of ante-mortem administration, and that the notebook found in his desk was a private record of medical observations and not an admission of wrongdoing. They presented 3 expert witnesses who each testified to the limitations of the forensic evidence. The prosecution's most powerful witness was not a forensic scientist. It was Karin Lunde. She took the stand on the 4th Sunday, the 4th day of the trial. She was in the witness box for 6 hours across 2 sessions. She described, with the precision and clarity of 19 years of professional proximity, every element of Solberg's working method that had eventually led her to the Board of Health Supervision. She described the morning. She prepared Ingeborg Thorsen's body. She described what she had noticed, and what it had taken her 2 years to find the courage to name. Solberg took the stand on the 23rd day of the trial. His testimony lasted 3 days. He was articulate, detailed, and composed throughout. He denied administering potassium chloride to any patient. He denied that the notebook contained what the prosecution alleged. He acknowledged making home visits to patients in their final periods of decline, and said this was standard rural medical practice. And then, on the 3rd day of his testimony, in answer to a question from the prosecutor about his relationship to his patients and his understanding of his role as their doctor, he said something that the courtroom received in complete silence, and that was quoted in every newspaper that covered the trial. Erik Solberg was convicted on all 7 counts of murder. On the 19th of April 2017, under Norwegian law, he received a sentence of 21 years, the maximum term available under the Norwegian Penal Code at the time of sentencing. He was also committed to compulsory psychiatric evaluation. He showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. Vesthavn required a new doctor. The process of finding a replacement GP for Vesthavn took 14 months. In the interim, a locum service operated from Stranda, requiring patients to make the 34-kilometer drive along the Storfjord road for non-emergency appointments. In winter, when the road was closed, this was not always possible. 2 patients requiring urgent care during that winter were airlifted to Stad-And, the village managed. But the managing of it, the particular difficulty of it, made visible something that had always been true, that a community of 847 people on a fjord in Western Norway needed a doctor, and that the doctor they had needed had been the wrong kind of man for 22 years. Karin Lunde continued working at the surgery for 2 years after the trial. She trained the new doctor in the specific requirements of a rural fjord practice, in the histories of the families she had known for decades, in the rhythms of a village that is cut off from everything by a single road and a winter ferry. In 2019, she retired. Her husband Tor still fishes the Storfjorden. They live at Fjordvegen 14. The kitchen window still looks out at the fjord. The large white timber house on the hill above the surgery was sold in 2018. The new owners repainted it a pale yellow. The dark green Volvo V70 had been impounded as evidence and was eventually auctioned. The chessboard in the study was donated to the community center. It sits now at the back table, where the Thursday chess club meets. The same table where Moen and Halvard Thorsen had their conversation. Nobody moved the pieces that were on it when the investigators found it. They have been in the same position, mid-game, for 9 years. Nobody has wanted to be the person who moves them. The Thursday Chess Club still meets at the community center. They play on Solberg's board. Most of the members are too young to have known him, or knew him only as a child knows the doctor, as a figure of authority and reassurance, not as a person. But 2 of the members knew him well. They play on his board. They have never discussed it. Some things in small communities are not said out loud. Some of them never will be. Erik Solberg is serving his sentence at a Norwegian correctional facility. Under Norwegian law, he is eligible for parole review after 2/3 of his sentence. He has given no public interviews. His lawyer has stated that he maintains the position he articulated in his trial testimony. He takes no visitors. Detective Inspector Astrid Moen was promoted to Detective Chief Inspector following the conclusion of the case. She is still based in the Myr-Og Romsdal Police District. She did not go back to Oslo. Halvard Thorsen gave a victim impact statement at the sentencing hearing. She described her mother, the nurse's training, the directness, the strength, the Tuesday evening phone calls from Vesthavn. She said her mother would have known exactly what was happening to her, and would have been unable to believe it, and that the impossibility of believing it is what made it possible. She said, "He killed her with her own trust in him. That is the most precise description I have." She sat down. The courtroom was silent. The Storfjorden has not changed. It was there before Vesthavn existed. It was there before the first house was built on the hillside, before the first fishing boat was launched from the stone quay, before the church was built at the top of the hill. It will be there after all of this. All of it. Every part of this story has been reduced to a few lines in a county archy and a case number in the Norwegian criminal register. The fjord does not record. The fjord does not remember. The fjord does not judge. It is simply there, cold and wide, and entirely indifferent to what human beings do to each other on its shore. 7 people are buried in the churchyard above Vesthavn. Their graves face the fjord. On a clear day, from the churchyard gate, you can see the far shore and the mountains above it, and the sky and the light on the water. It is a beautiful view. They had it for their whole lives. They have it still. That is the full case of Dr. Erik Solberg, the good doctor of Vesthavn.